Chapter 26 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 26. An Unexpected Meeting and a Promising Prospect. The laws of sympathy between beards and birds, and the secret source of that attraction which frequently impels a shaver of the one to be a dealer in the other, are questions for the subtle reasoning of scientific bodies, not the less so because their investigation would seem calculated to lead to no particular result. It is enough to know that the artist who had the honor of entertaining Mrs. Gamp as his first-floor lodger united the two pursuits of barbering and bird-fancying, and that it was not an original idea of his, but one in which he had, dispersed about the by-streets and suburbs of the town, a host of rivals. The name of the householder was Paul Sweedlepipe, but he was commonly called Poll Sweedlepipe, and was not uncommonly believed to have been so christened among his friends and neighbors. With the exception of the staircase and his lodger's private apartment, Poll Sweedlepipe's house was one great bird's nest. Gamecocks resided in the kitchen, pheasants wasted the brightness of their golden plumage on the garret, bantams roosted in the cellar, owls had possession of the bedroom, and specimens of all the smaller fry of birds chirruped and twittered in the shop. The staircase was sacred to rabbits. There, in hutches of all shapes and kinds, made from old packing cases, boxes, drawers, and tea chests, they increased in a prodigious degree, and contributed their share towards that complicated whiff which, quite impartially and without distinction of persons, saluted every nose that was put into Sweedlepipe's easy shaving shop. Many noses found their way there, for all that, especially on Sunday morning before church time. Even archbishops shave, or must be shaved, on a Sunday, and beards will grow after 12 o'clock on Saturday night, though it be upon the chins of base mechanics, who, not being able to engage their valets by the quarter, hire them by the job, and pay them, oh, the wickedness of copper coin, in dirty pence. Poll Sweedlepipe, the sinner, shaved all comers at a penny each, and cut the hair of any customer for twopence, and being a lone unmarried man, and having some connection in the bird line, Poll got on tolerably well. He was a little elderly man, with a clammy cold right hand, from which even rabbits and birds could not remove the smell of shaving soap. Poll had something of the bird in his nature. Not of the hawk or eagle, but of the sparrow, that builds in chimney stacks, and inclines to human company. He was not quarrelsome, though, like the sparrow, but peaceful, like the dove. In his walk he strutted, and in this respect he bore a faint resemblance to the pigeon, as well as in a certain prosiness of speech, which might, in its monotony, be likened to the cooing of that bird. He was very inquisitive, and when he stood at his shop door in the evening tide, watching the neighbors, with his head on one side, and his eye cocked knowingly, there was a dash of the raven in him. Yet there was no more wickedness in Poll than in a robin. Happily, too, when any of his ornithological properties were on the verge of going too far, they were quenched, dissolved, melted down, and neutralized in the barber, just as his bald head, otherwise as the head of a shaved magpie, lost itself in a wig of curly black ringlets, parted on one side and cut away almost to the crown, to indicate immense capacity of intellect. Poll had a very small, shrill, treble voice, which might have led the wags of Kingsgate Street to insist the more upon his feminine designation. He had a tender heart, too, for when he had a good commission to provide 3 or 4 score sparrows for a shooting match, he would observe, in a compassionate tone, how singular it was that sparrows should have been made expressly for such purposes. The question whether men were made to shoot them never entered into Poll's philosophy. Poll wore, in his sporting character, a velveteen coat, a great deal of blue stocking, ankle boots, a neckerchief of some bright color, and a very tall hat. Pursuing his more quiet occupation of barber, he generally subsided into an apron, not over clean, a flannel jacket, and corduroy knee shorts. It was in this latter costume, but with his apron girded round his waist, as a token of his having shut up shop for the night, that he closed the door one evening some weeks after the occurrences detailed in the last chapter, and stood upon the steps in Kingsgate Street, listening until the little cracked bell within should leave off ringing, for until it did, this was Mr. Sweedlepipe's reflection, the place never seemed quiet enough to be left to itself. "It's the greediest little bell to ring," said Paul, "that ever was. But it's quiet at last." He rolled his apron up a little tighter as he said these words, and hastened down the street. Just as he was turning into Holborn, he ran against a young gentleman in a livery. This youth was bold, though small, and with several lively expressions of displeasure turned upon him instantly. "Now, stoopid!" cried the young gentleman. "Can't you look where you're a-going to, eh? Can't you mind where you're a-coming to, eh? What do you think your eyes was made for, eh? Ah? Yes? Oh? Now then!" The young gentleman pronounced the last two words in a very loud tone and with frightful emphasis, as though they contained within themselves the essence of the direst aggravation. But he had scarcely done so when his anger yielded to surprise, and he cried, in a milder tone, "What, Polly?" "Why, it ain't you, sure," cried Paul. "It can't be you." "No, it ain't me," returned the youth. "It's my son, my oldest one. He's a credit to his father, ain't he, Polly?" With this delicate little piece of banter he halted on the pavement and went round and round in circles, for the better exhibition of his figure, rather to the inconvenience of the passengers generally, who were not in an equal state of spirits with himself. "I wouldn't have believed it," said Paul. "What, you've left your old place then, have you?" "Have I?" returned his young friend, who had by this time stuck his hands into the pockets of his white cord breeches, and was swaggering along at the barber's side. "Do you know a pair of top boots when you see 'em, Polly? Look here." "Beautiful!" cried Mr. Sweedlepipe. "Do you know a slap-up sort of button when you see it?" said the youth. "Don't look at mine if you ain't a judge, because these lions' heads was made for men of taste, not snobs." "Beautiful!" cried the barber again. "A grass green frock coat, too, bound with gold, and a cockade in your hat." "I should hope so," replied the youth. "Blow the cockade, though, for except that it don't turn round, it's like the wentilator that used to be in the kitchen winder at Todgers's. You ain't seen the old lady's name in the Gazette, have you?" "No," returned the barber. "Is she a bankrupt?" "If she ain't, she will be," retorted Bailey. "That business never can be carried on without me. Well, how are you?" "Oh, I'm pretty well," said Paul. "Are you living at this end of the town, or were you coming to see me? Was that the business that brought you to Holborn?" "I haven't got no business in Holborn," returned Bailey, with some displeasure. "All my business lays at the West End. I've got the right sort of governor now. You can't see his face for his whiskers, and can't see his whiskers for the dye upon 'em. That's a gentleman, ain't it? You wouldn't like a ride in a cab, would you? Why, it wouldn't be safe to offer it. You'd faint away, only to see me a-coming at a mild trot round the corner." To convey a slight idea of the effect of this approach, Mr. Bailey counterfeited in his own person the action of a high-trotting horse, and threw up his head so high in backing against a pump that he shook his hat off. "Why, he's own uncle to Capricorn," said Bailey, "and brother to Cauliflower. He's been through the winders of 2 Chaney shops since we've had him, and was sold for killing his missus. That's a horse, I hope." "Ah, you'll never want to buy any more red Pauls now," observed Paul, looking on his young friend with an air of melancholy. "You'll never want to buy any more red Pauls now to hang up over the sink, will you?" "I should think not," replied Bailey. "Reether so. I wouldn't have nothin' to say to any bird below a peacock, and he'd be wulgar. Well, how are you?" "Oh, I'm pretty well," said Paul. He answered the question again because Mr. Bailey asked it again. Mr. Bailey asked it again because, accompanied with a straddling action of the white cords, a bend of the knees, and a striking forth of the top boots, it was an easy, horsefleshy, turfy sort of thing to do. "What are you up to, old feller?" added Mr. Bailey, with the same graceful rakishness. He was quite the man about town of the conversation, while the easy shaver was the child. "Why, I am going to fetch my lodger home," said Paul. "A woman?" cried Mr. Bailey. For a 20 pund note?" The little barber hastened to explain that she was neither a young woman nor a handsome woman, but a nurse, who had been acting as a kind of housekeeper to a gentleman for some weeks past, and left her place that night in consequence of being superseded by another and a more legitimate housekeeper, to wit, the gentleman's bride. "He's newly married, and he brings his young wife home to night," said the barber, "so I'm going to fetch my lodger away, Mr. Chuzzlewit's, close behind the post office, and carry her box for her." "Jonas Chuzzlewit's?" said Bailey. "Ah," returned Paul, "that's the name, sure enough. Do you know him?" "Oh, no!" cried Mr. Bailey, "not at all. And I don't know her, not neither. Why, they first kept company through me a'most." "Ah?" said Paul. "Ah," said Mr. Bailey with a wink. "And she ain't bad looking, mind you. But her sister was the best. She was the merry one. I often used to have a bit of fun with her in the hold times." Mr. Bailey spoke as if he already had a leg and 3/4 in the grave, and this had happened 20 or 30 years ago. Paul Sweedlepipe, the meek, was so perfectly confounded by his precocious self-possession and his patronizing manner, as well as by his boots, cockade, and livery, that a mist swam before his eyes, and he saw, not the Bailey of acknowledged juvenility from Todgers's commercial boarding house, who had made his acquaintance within a 12-month by purchasing, at sundry times, small birds at 2d. each, but a highly condensed embodiment of all the sporting grooms in London, an abstract of all the stable knowledge of the time, a something at a high pressure that must have had existence many years and was fraught with terrible experiences. And truly, though in the cloudy atmosphere of Todgers's Mr. Bailey's genius had ever shone out brightly in this particular respect, it now eclipsed both time and space, cheated beholders of their senses, and worked on their belief in defiance of all natural laws. He walked along the tangible and real stones of Holborn Hill, an undersized boy, and yet he winked the winks and thought the thoughts and did the deeds and said the sayings of an ancient man. There was an old principle within him and a young surface without. He became an inexplicable creature, a breeched and booted sphinx. There was no course open to the barber but to go distracted himself or to take Bailey for granted, and he wisely chose the latter. Mr. Bailey was good enough to continue to bear him company and to entertain him as they went with easy conversation on various sporting topics, especially on the comparative merits, as a general principle, of horses with white stockings and horses without. In regard to the style of tail to be preferred, Mr. Bailey had opinions of his own, which he explained, but begged they might by no means influence his friends, as here he knew he had the misfortune to differ from some excellent authorities. He treated Mr. Sweedlepipe to a dram, compounded agreeably to his own directions, which he informed him had been invented by a member of the Jockey Club, and as they were by this time near the barber's destination, he observed that as he had an hour to spare and knew the parties, he would, if quite agreeable, be introduced to Mrs. Gamp. Paul knocked at Jonas Chuzzlewit's, and, on the door being opened by that lady, made the two distinguished persons known to one another. It was a happy feature in Mrs. Gamp's twofold profession that it gave her an interest in everything that was young as well as in everything that was old. She received Mr. Bailey with much kindness. "It's very good, I'm sure, of you to come," she said to her landlord, "as well as bring so nice a friend, but I'm afraid that I must trouble you so far as to step in, for the young couple has not yet made appearance." "They're late, ain't they?" inquired her landlord, when she had conducted them downstairs into the kitchen. "Well, sir, considerin' the wings of love, they are," said Mrs. Gamp. Mr. Bailey inquired whether the wings of love had ever won a plate, or could be backed to do anything remarkable, and being informed that it was not a horse but merely a poetical or figurative expression, evinced considerable disgust. Mrs. Gamp was so very much astonished by his affable manners and great ease that she was about to propound to her landlord in a whisper the staggering inquiry whether he was a man or a boy, when Mr. Sweedlepipe, anticipating her design, made a timely diversion. "He knows Mrs. Chuzzlewit," said Paul aloud. "There's nothing he don't know, that's my opinion," observed Mrs. Gamp. "All the wickedness of the world is print to him." Mr. Bailey received this as a compliment, and said, adjusting his cravat, "Reether so." "As you knows Mrs. Chuzzlewit, you knows perhaps what her Christen name is," Mrs. Gamp observed. "Charity," said Bailey. "That it ain't," cried Mrs. Gamp. "Cherry, then," said Bailey. "Cherry's short for it. It's all the same." "It don't begin with a C at all," retorted Mrs. Gamp, shaking her head. "It begins with a M." "Whew!" cried Mr. Bailey, slapping a little cloud of pipe clay out of his left leg. "Then he's been and married the merry one." As these words were mysterious, Mrs. Gamp called upon him to explain, which Mr. Bailey proceeded to do, that lady listening greedily to everything he said. He was yet in the fullness of his narrative when the sound of wheels and a double knock at the street door announced the arrival of the newly married couple. Begging him to reserve what more he had to say for her hearing on the way home, Mrs. Gamp took up the candle and hurried away to receive and welcome the young mistress of the house. "Wishing you 'appiness and joy with all my 'art," said Mrs. Gamp, dropping a curtsy as they entered the hall. "And you too, sir. Your lady looks a little tired with the journey, Mr. Chuzzlewit. A pretty dear." "She has bothered enough about it," grumbled Mr. Jonas. "Now show a light, will you?" "This way, ma'am, if you please," said Mrs. Gamp, going upstairs before them. "Things has been made as comfortable as they could be, but there's many things you'll have to alter your own self when you gets time to look about you. Ah, sweet thing, but you don't," added Mrs. Gamp internally, "you don't look much like a merry one, I must say." It was true she did not. The death that had gone before the bridal seemed to have left its shade upon the house. The air was heavy and oppressive. The rooms were dark. A deep gloom filled up every chink and corner. Upon the hearthstone, like a creature of ill omen, sat the aged clerk, with his eyes fixed on some withered branches in the stove. He rose and looked at her. "So there you are, Mr. Chuff," said Jonas carelessly, as he dusted his boots. "Still in the land of the living, eh?" "Still in the land of the living, sir," retorted Mrs. Gamp, "and Mr. Chuffy may thank you for it, as many and many a time I've told him." Mr. Jonas was not in the best of humors, for he merely said as he looked round, "We don't want you any more, you know, Mrs. Gamp." "I'm a going immediate, sir," returned the nurse, "unless there's nothink I can do for you, ma'am, ain't there?" said Mrs. Gamp, with a look of great sweetness, and rummaging all the time in her pocket. "Ain't there nothink I can do for you, my little bird?" "No," said Mary, almost crying. "You had better go away, please." With a leer of mingled sweetness and slyness, with one eye on the future, one on the bride, and an arch expression in her face, partly spiritual, partly spirituous, and wholly professional and peculiar to her art, Mrs. Gamp rummaged in her pocket again and took from it a printed card, whereon was an inscription copied from her signboard. "Would you be so good, my darling dovey of a dear young married lady," Mrs. Gamp observed in a low voice, "as put that somewheres where you can keep it in your mind. I'm well beknown to many ladies, and it's my card. Gamp is my name, and Gamp my nater. Livin' quite handy, I will make so bold as call in now and then and make inquiry how your health and spirits is, my precious chick." And with innumerable leers, winks, coughs, nods, smiles, and curtsies, all leading to the establishment of a mysterious and confidential understanding between herself and the bride, Mrs. Gamp, invoking a blessing upon the house, leered, winked, coughed, nodded, smiled, and curtsied herself out of the room. "But I will say, and I would if I was led a Martha to the stakes for it," Mrs. Gamp remarked below stairs in a whisper, "that she don't look much like a merry one at this present moment of time." "Ah, wait till you hear her laugh," said Bailey. "Hem!" cried Mrs. Gamp in a kind of groan. "I will, child." They said no more in the house, for Mrs. Gamp put on her bonnet, Mr. Sweedlepipe took up her box, and Mr. Bailey accompanied them towards Kingsgate Street, recounting to Mrs. Gamp as they went along the origin and progress of his acquaintance with Mrs. Chuzzlewit and her sister. It was a pleasant instance of this youth's precocity that he fancied Mrs. Gamp had conceived a tenderness for him and was much tickled by her misplaced attachment. As the door closed heavily behind them, Mrs. Jonas sat down in a chair and felt a strange chill creep upon her, whilst she looked about the room. It was pretty much as she had known it, but appeared more dreary. She had thought to see it brighten to receive her. "It ain't good enough for you, I suppose," said Jonas, watching her looks. "Why, it is dull," said Mary, trying to be more herself. "It'll be duller before you're done with it," retorted Jonas, "if you give me any of your airs. You're a nice article to turn sulky on first coming home. Ecod, you used to have life enough when you could plague me with it. The gal's downstairs. Ring the bell for supper while I take my boots off." She roused herself from looking after him as he left the room, to do what he had desired, when the old man Chuffy laid his hand softly on her arm. "You are not married?" he said eagerly. "Not married?" "Yes, a month ago. Good heaven, what is the matter?" He answered nothing was the matter, and turned from her. But in her fear and wonder, turning also, she saw him raise his trembling hands above his head, and heard him say, "Oh, woe, woe, woe upon this wicked house!" It was her welcome home. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27, Part 1, of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 27, showing that old friends may not only appear with new faces, but in false colors, that people are prone to bite, and that biters may sometimes be bitten. Mr. Bailey, Jr., for the sporting character, while of general utility at Todgers's, had now regularly set up in life under that name, without troubling himself to obtain from the legislature a direct license in the form of a private bill, which of all kinds and classes of bills is without exception the most unreasonable in its charges. Mr. Bailey, Jr., just tall enough to be seen by an inquiring eye, gazing indolently at society from beneath the apron of his master's cab, drove slowly up and down Pall Mall about the hour of noon, in waiting for his governor. The horse of distinguished family, who had Capricorn for his nephew and Cauliflower for his brother, showed himself worthy of his high relations by champing at the bit until his chest was white with foam, and rearing like a horse in heraldry. The plated harness and the patent leather glittered in the sun. Pedestrians admired. Mr. Bailey was complacent, but unmoved. He seemed to say, "A barrow, good people, a mere barrow, nothing to what we could do if we chose." And on he went, squaring his short green arms outside the apron, as if he were hooked on to it by his armpits. Mr. Bailey had a great opinion of Brother to Cauliflower, and estimated his powers highly. But he never told him so. On the contrary, it was his practice, in driving that animal, to assail him with disrespectful, if not injurious, expressions, as, "Ah, would you? Did you think it then? Where are you going to now? No, you won't, my lad," and similar fragmentary remarks. These, being usually accompanied by a jerk of the rein or a crack of the whip, led to many trials of strength between them, and to many contentions for the upper hand, terminating now and then in china shops and other unusual goals, as Mr. Bailey had already hinted to his friend Paul Sweedlepipe. On the present occasion Mr. Bailey, being in spirits, was more than commonly hard upon his charge, in consequence of which that fiery animal confined himself almost entirely to his hind legs in displaying his paces, and constantly got himself into positions with reference to the cabriolet that very much amazed the passengers in the street. But Mr. Bailey, not at all disturbed, had still a shower of pleasantries to bestow on any one who crossed his path, as, calling to a full-grown coal-heaver in a wagon, who for a moment blocked the way, "Now, young 'un, who trusted you with the cart?" Inquiring of elderly ladies who wanted to cross and ran back again, why they didn't go to the workhouse and get an order to be buried. tempting boys with friendly words to get up behind and immediately afterwards cutting them down, and the like flashes of a cheerful humour, which he would occasionally relieve by going round St. James's Square at a hand gallop and coming slowly into Pall Mall by another entry, as if, in the interval, his pace had been a perfect crawl. It was not until these amusements had been very often repeated, and the apple stall at the corner had sustained so many miraculous escapes as to appear impregnable, that Mr. Bailey was summoned to the door of a certain house in Pall Mall, and, turning short, obeyed the call and jumped out. It was not until he had held the bridle for some minutes longer, every jerk of Cauliflower's brother's head and every twitch of Cauliflower's brother's nostril taking him off his legs in the meanwhile, that two persons entered the vehicle, one of whom took the reins and drove rapidly off. Nor was it until Mr. Bailey had run after it some hundreds of yards in vain that he managed to lift his short leg into the iron step, and finally to get his boots upon the little footboard behind. Then, indeed, he became a sight to see, and standing now on one foot and now upon the other, now trying to look round the cab on this side, now on that, and now endeavouring to peep over the top of it as it went dashing in among the carts and coaches, was from head to heel Newmarket. The appearance of Mr. Bailey's governor as he drove along fully justified that enthusiastic youth's description of him to the wondering Paul. He had a world of jet-black shining hair upon his head, upon his cheeks, upon his chin, upon his upper lip. His clothes, symmetrically made, were of the newest fashion and the costliest kind. Flowers of gold and blue and green and blushing red were on his waistcoat. Precious chains and jewels sparkled on his breast. His fingers, clogged with brilliant rings, were as unwieldy as summer flies, but newly rescued from a honey-pot. The daylight mantled in his gleaming hat and boots as in a polished glass. And yet, though changed his name and changed his outward surface, it was Tigg. Though turned and twisted upside down and inside out, as great men have been sometimes known to be, though no longer Montague Tigg, but Tigg Montague, still it was Tigg, the same satanic, gallant, military Tigg. The brass was burnished, lacquered, newly stamped, yet it was the true Tigg metal notwithstanding. Beside him sat a smiling gentleman of less pretensions and of business looks, whom he addressed as David. Surely not the David of the, how shall it be phrased, the triumvirate of golden balls? Not David, tapster at the Lombard's Arms? Yes, the very man. "The secretary's salary, David," said Mr. Montague, "the office being now established, is £800 per annum, with his house rent, coals, and candles free. His 25 shares he holds, of course. Is that enough?" David smiled and nodded and coughed behind a little locked portfolio which he carried, with an air that proclaimed him to be the secretary in question. "If that's enough," said Montague, "I will propose it at the board to-day in my capacity as chairman." The secretary smiled again, laughed indeed this time, and said, rubbing his nose slyly with one end of the portfolio, "It was a capital thought, wasn't it?" "What was a capital thought, David?" Mr. Montague inquired. "The Anglo-Bengali," tittered the secretary. "The Anglo-Bengali Disinterested Loan and Life Assurance Company is rather a capital concern, I hope, David," said Montague. "Capital indeed!" cried the secretary with another laugh. "In one sense." "In the only important one," observed the chairman, "which is number one, David." "What?" asked the secretary, bursting into another laugh. "What will be the paid-up capital according to the next prospectus?" "A figure of 2 and as many oughts after it as the printer can get into the same line," replied his friend. "Ha, ha!" At this they both laughed, the secretary so vehemently that in kicking up his feet he kicked the apron open and nearly startled Cauliflower's brother into an oyster shop, not to mention Mr. Bailey's receiving such a sudden swing that he held on for a moment quite a young fame by one strap and no legs. "What a chap you are!" exclaimed David admiringly when this little alarm had subsided. "Say genius, David, genius." "Well, upon my soul, you are a genius then," said David. I always knew you had the gift of the gab, of course, but I never believed you were half the man you are. How could I?" "I rise with circumstances, David. That's a point of genius in itself," said Tigg. "If you were to lose £100 wager to me at this minute, David, and were to pay it, which is most confoundedly improbable, I should rise, in a mental point of view, directly." It is due to Mr. Tigg to say that he had really risen with his opportunities, and peculating on a grander scale he had become a grander man altogether. "Ha, ha!" cried the secretary, laying his hand with growing familiarity upon the chairman's arm. "When I look at you and think of your property in Bengal being ha, ha, ha!" The half-expressed idea seemed no less ludicrous to Mr. Tigg than to his friend, for he laughed too, heartily. "Being," resumed David, "being amenable, your property in Bengal being amenable to all claims upon the company. When I look at you and think of that, you might tickle me into fits by waving the feather of a pen at me. Upon my soul you might." "It's a devilish fine property," said Tigg Montague, "to be amenable to any claims. The preserve of tigers alone is worth a mint of money, David." David could only reply, in the intervals of his laughter, "Oh, what a chap you are!" and so continued to laugh and hold his sides and wipe his eyes for some time without offering any other observation. "A capital idea?" said Tigg, returning after a time to his companion's first remark. "No doubt it was a capital idea. It was my idea." "No, no, it was my idea," said David. "Hang it, let a man have some credit. Didn't I say to you that I'd saved a few pounds?" "You said—" "Didn't I say to you," interposed Tigg, "that I had come into a few pounds?" "Certainly you did," returned David warmly, "but that's not the idea. Who said that if we put the money together we could furnish an office and make a show?" "And who said," retorted Mr. Tigg, "that provided we did it on a sufficiently large scale we could furnish an office and make a show without any money at all? Be rational and just and calm, and tell me whose idea was that." "Why, there," David was obliged to confess, "you had the advantage of me, I admit. But I don't put myself on a level with you. I only want a little credit in the business." "All the credit you deserve to have," said Tigg. "The plain work of the company, David, figures, books, circulars, advertisements, pens, ink and paper, sealing wax and wafers, is admirably done by you. You are a first-rate groveller. I don't dispute it. But the ornamental department, David, the inventive and poetical department, is entirely yours," said his friend. "No question of it. But with such a swell turnout as this, and all the handsome things you've got about you, and the life you lead, I mean to say it's a precious comfortable department, too." "Does it gain the purpose? Is it Anglo-Bengali?" asked Tigg. "Yes," said David. "Could you undertake it yourself?" demanded Tigg. "No," said David. "Ha, ha!" laughed Tigg. "Then be contented with your station and your profits, David, my fine fellow, and bless the day that made us acquainted across the counter of our common uncle, for it was a golden day to you." It will have been already gathered from the conversation of these worthies that they were embarked in an enterprise of some magnitude, in which they addressed the public in general from the strong position of having everything to gain and nothing at all to lose, and which, based upon this great principle, was thriving pretty comfortably. The Anglo-Bengali Disinterested Loan and Life Assurance Company started into existence one morning, not an infant institution, but a grown-up company, running alone at a great pace, and doing business right and left, with a branch and a first floor over a tailor's at the west end of the town, and main offices in a new street in the city, comprising the upper part of a spacious house, resplendent in stucco and plate glass, with wire blinds in all the windows, and Anglo-Bengali worked into the pattern of every one of them. On the doorpost was painted again in large letters, "Offices of the Anglo-Bengali Disinterested Loan and Life Assurance Company." And on the door was a large brass plate with the same inscription, always kept very bright, as courting inquiry, staring the city out of countenance after office hours on working days, and all day long on Sundays, and looking bolder than the bank. Within, the offices were newly plastered, newly painted, newly papered, newly countered, newly floor-clothed, newly tabled, newly chaired, newly fitted up in every way with goods that were substantial and expensive, and designed, like the company, to last. Business! Look at the green ledgers with red backs like strong cricket balls beaten flat. The court guides directories, day books, almanacs, letter boxes, weighing machines for letters, rows of fire buckets for dashing out a conflagration in its first spark, and saving the immense wealth in notes and bonds belonging to the company. Look at the iron safes, the clock, the office seal in its capacious self, security for anything. Solidity. Look at the massive blocks of marble in the chimney pieces and the gorgeous parapet on the top of the house. Publicity. Why, Anglo-Bengali Disinterested Loan and Life Assurance Company is painted on the very coal scuttles. It is repeated at every turn until the eyes are dazzled with it and the head is giddy. It is engraved upon the top of all the letter paper, and it makes a scroll work round the seal, and it shines out of the porter's buttons. And it is repeated 20 times in every circular and public notice wherein one David Crimple, Esquire, Secretary and Resident Director, takes the liberty of inviting your attention to the accompanying statement of the advantages offered by the Anglo-Bengali Disinterested Loan and Life Assurance Company, and fully proves to you that any connection on your part with that establishment must result in a perpetual Christmas box and constantly increasing bonus to yourself, and that nobody can run any risk by the transaction except the office, which, in its great liberality, is pretty sure to lose. And this David Crimple, Esquire, submits to you, and the odds are heavy you believe him, is the best guarantee that can reasonably be suggested by the Board of Management for its permanence and stability. This gentleman's name, by the way, had been originally Crimp, but as the word was susceptible of an awkward construction and might be misrepresented, he had altered it to Crimple. Lest with all these proofs and confirmations any man should be suspicious of the Anglo-Bengali Disinterested Loan and Life Assurance Company, should doubt in Tiger, cab, or person, Tig Montague, Esquire, of Pall Mall and Bengal, or any other name in the imaginative list of directors, there was a porter on the premises, a wonderful creature, in a vast red waistcoat and a short-tailed pepper and salt coat, who carried more conviction to the minds of skeptics than the whole establishment without him. No confidences existed between him and the directorship. Nobody knew where he had served last. No character or explanation had been given or required. No questions had been asked on either side. This mysterious being, relying solely on his figure, had applied for the situation, and had been instantly engaged on his own terms. They were high, but he knew, doubtless, that no man could carry such an extent of waistcoat as himself, and felt the full value of his capacity to such an institution. When he sat upon a seat erected for him in a corner of the office, with his glazed hat hanging on a peg over his head, it was impossible to doubt the respectability of the concern. It went on doubling itself with every square inch of his red waistcoat, until, like the problem of the nails in the horse's shoes, the total became enormous. People had been known to apply to effect an insurance on their lives for £1,000, and, looking at him, to beg, before the form of proposal was filled up, that it might be made 2. And yet he was not a giant. His coat was rather small than otherwise. The whole charm was in his waistcoat. Respectability, competence, property in Bengal or anywhere else, responsibility to any amount on the part of the company that employed him, were all expressed in that one garment. Rival offices had endeavoured to lure him away. Lombard Street itself had beckoned to him. Rich companies had whispered, "Be a beadle." But he still continued faithful to the Anglo-Bengali. Whether he was a deep rogue or a stately simpleton, it was impossible to make out. But he appeared to believe in the Anglo-Bengali. He was grave with imaginary cares of office, and, having nothing whatever to do and something less to take care of, would look as if the pressure of his numerous duties and a sense of the treasure in the company's strong room made him a solemn and a thoughtful man. As the cabriolet drove up to the door, this officer appeared bareheaded on the pavement, crying aloud, "Room for the chairman! Room for the chairman, if you please!" much to the admiration of the bystanders, who, it is needless to say, had their attention directed to the Anglo-Bengali company thenceforth by that means. Mr. Tigg leaped gracefully out, followed by the managing director, who was by this time very distant and respectful, and ascended the stairs, still preceded by the porter, who cried as he went, "By your leave there, by your leave! The chairman of the board, gentlemen!" In like manner, but in a still more stentorian voice, he ushered the chairman through the public office, where some humble clients were transacting business, into an awful chamber labelled Board Room, the door of which sanctuary immediately closed, and screened the great capitalist from vulgar eyes. The board room had a Turkey carpet in it, a sideboard, a portrait of Tigg Montague, Esquire, as chairman, a very imposing chair of office, garnished with an ivory hammer and a little hand-bell, and a long table set out at intervals with sheets of blotting paper, foolscap, clean pens, and inkstands. The chairman having taken his seat with great solemnity, the secretary supported him on his right hand, and the porter stood bolt upright behind them, forming a warm background of waistcoat. This was the board, everything else being a light-hearted little fiction. "Bullamy," said Mr. Tigg. "Sir," replied the porter. "Let the medical officer know, with my compliments, that I wish to see him." Bullamy cleared his throat and bustled out into the office, crying, "The chairman of the board wishes to see the medical officer. By your leave there, by your leave." He soon returned with the gentleman in question, and at both openings of the board room door, at his coming in and at his going out, simple clients were seen to stretch their necks and stand upon their toes, thirsting to catch the slightest glimpse of that mysterious chamber. "Jobling, my dear friend," said Mr. Tigg, "how are you? Bullamy, wait outside. Crimple, don't leave us. Jobling, my good fellow, I am glad to see you. And how are you, Mr. Montague, eh?" said the medical officer, throwing himself luxuriously into an easy chair (they were all easy chairs in the board room), and taking a handsome gold snuff box from the pocket of his black satin waistcoat. "How are you? A little worn with business, eh? If so, rest. A little feverish from wine? Humph! If so, water. Nothing at all the matter, and quite comfortable? Then take some lunch. A very wholesome thing at this time of day to strengthen the gastric juices with lunch, Mr. Montague." The medical officer, he was the same medical officer who had followed poor old Anthony Chuzzlewit to the grave, and who had attended Mrs. Gamp's patient at the Bull, smiled in saying these words, and casually added, as he brushed some grains of snuff from his shirt frill, "I always take it myself about this time of day, do you know?" "Bullamy," said the chairman, ringing the little bell. "Sir." "Lunch." "Not on my account, I hope," said the doctor. "You are very good. Thank you. I'm quite ashamed. Ha ha! If I had been a sharp practitioner, Mr. Montague, I shouldn't have mentioned it without a fee. For you may depend upon it, my dear sir, that if you don't make a point of taking lunch, you'll very soon come under my hands. Allow me to illustrate this. In Mr. Crimple's leg—" The resident director gave an involuntary start, for the doctor, in the heat of his demonstration, caught it up and laid it across his own, as if he were going to take it off then and there. "In Mr. Crimple's leg, you'll observe," pursued the doctor, turning back his cuffs and spanning the limb with both hands, "where Mr. Crimple's knee fits into the socket, here, there is, that is to say, between the bone and the socket, a certain quantity of animal oil." "What do you pick my leg out for?" said Mr. Crimple, looking with something of an anxious expression at his limb. "It's the same with other legs, ain't it?" "Never you mind, my good sir," returned the doctor, shaking his head, "whether it is the same with other legs or not the same." "But I do mind," said David. "I take a particular case, Mr. Montague," returned the doctor, "as illustrating my remark, you observe. In this portion of Mr. Crimple's leg, sir, there is a certain amount of animal oil. In every one of Mr. Crimple's joints, sir, there is more or less of the same deposit. Very good. If Mr. Crimple neglects his meals or fails to take his proper quantity of rest, that oil wanes and becomes exhausted. What is the consequence? Mr. Crimple's bones sink down into their sockets, sir, and Mr. Crimple becomes a weazen, puny, stunted, miserable man." The doctor let Mr. Crimple's leg fall suddenly, as if he were already in that agreeable condition, turned down his wristbands again, and looked triumphantly at the chairman. "We know a few secrets of nature in our profession, sir," said the doctor. "Of course we do. We study for that. We pass the hall and the college for that. And we take our station in society by that. It's extraordinary how little is known on these subjects generally. Where do you suppose now," the doctor closed one eye as he leaned back smilingly in his chair, and formed a triangle with his hands, of which his two thumbs composed the base, "where do you suppose Mr. Crimple's stomach is?" Mr. Crimple, more agitated than before, clapped his hand immediately below his waistcoat. "Not at all," cried the doctor. "Not at all. Quite a popular mistake, my good sir. You're altogether deceived." "I feel it there when it's out of order, that's all I know," said Crimple. "You think you do," replied the doctor, "but science knows better. There was a patient of mine once," touching one of the many mourning rings upon his fingers, and slightly bowing his head, "a gentleman who did me the honour to make a very handsome mention of me in his will, in testimony, as he was pleased to say, of the unremitting zeal, talent, and attention of my friend and medical attendant, John Jobling, Esquire, M.R.C.S., who was so overcome by the idea of having all his life laboured under an erroneous view of the locality of this important organ, that when I assured him on my professional reputation he was mistaken, he burst into tears, put out his hand, and said, 'Jobling, God bless you.' Immediately afterwards he became speechless, and was ultimately buried at Brixton." "By your leave there!" cried Bullamy without. "By your leave! Refreshment for the board room." "Ha!" said the doctor jocularly, as he rubbed his hands and drew his chair nearer to the table. "The true life assurance, Mr. Montague. The best policy in the world, my dear sir. We should be provident, and eat and drink whenever we can, eh, Mr. Crimple?" The resident director acquiesced rather sulkily, as if the gratification of replenishing his stomach had been impaired by the unsettlement of his preconceived opinions in reference to its situation. But the appearance of the porter and under porter with a tray covered with a snow white cloth, which, being thrown back, displayed a pair of cold roast fowls, flanked by some potted meats and a cool salad, quickly restored his good humour. It was enhanced still further by the arrival of a bottle of excellent Madeira and another of champagne, and he soon attacked the repast with an appetite scarcely inferior to that of the medical officer. End of Chapter 27, Part 1. Chapter 27, Part 2 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 27, Part 2. The lunch was handsomely served, with a profusion of rich glass plate and china, which seemed to denote that eating and drinking on a showy scale formed no unimportant item in the business of the Anglo-Bengali directorship. As it proceeded, the medical officer grew more and more joyous and red-faced, insomuch that every mouthful he ate and every drop of wine he swallowed seemed to impart new lustre to his eyes, and to light up new sparks in his nose and forehead. In certain quarters of the city and its neighbourhood, Mr. Jobling was, as we have already seen in some measure, a very popular character. He had a portentously sagacious chin, and a pompous voice, with a rich huskiness in some of its tones that went directly to the heart, like a ray of light shining through the ruddy medium of choice old Burgundy. His neckerchief and shirt frill were ever of the whitest, his clothes of the blackest and sleekest, his gold watch chain of the heaviest, and his seals of the largest. His boots, which were always of the brightest, creaked as he walked. Perhaps he could shake his head, rub his hands, or warm himself before a fire better than any man alive, and he had a peculiar way of smacking his lips and saying "Ah" at intervals, while patients detailed their symptoms, which inspired great confidence. It seemed to express, "I know what you're going to say better than you do, but go on, go on." As he talked on all occasions, whether he had anything to say or not, it was unanimously observed of him that he was full of anecdote, and his experience and profit from it were considered, for the same reason, to be something much too extensive for description. His female patients could never praise him too highly, and the coldest of his male admirers would always say this for him to their friends, that whatever Jobling's professional skill might be, and it could not be denied that he had a very high reputation, he was one of the most comfortable fellows you ever saw in your life. Jobling was, for many reasons, and not last in the list because his connection lay principally among tradesmen and their families, exactly the sort of person whom the Anglo-Bengali Company wanted for a medical officer. But Jobling was far too knowing to connect himself with the company in any closer ties than as a paid, and well paid, functionary, or to allow his connection to be misunderstood abroad if he could help it. Hence he always stated the case to an inquiring patient after this manner: "Why, my dear sir, with regard to the Anglo-Bengali, my information, you see, is limited, very limited. I am the medical officer in consideration of a certain monthly payment. The labourer is worthy of his hire. Bis dat qui si to dat. Classical scholar, Jobling, thinks the patient, well-read man. And I receive it regularly. Therefore I am bound, so far as my own knowledge goes, to speak well of the establishment. Nothing can be fairer than Jobling's conduct, thinks the patient, who has just paid Jobling's bill himself. If you put any question to me, my dear friend, says the doctor, touching the responsibility or capital of the company, there I am at fault, for I have no head for figures, and not being a shareholder am delicate of showing any curiosity whatever on the subject. Delicacy, your amiable lady will agree with me, I am sure, should be one of the first characteristics of a medical man. Nothing can be finer or more gentlemanly than Jobling's feelings, thinks the patient. Very good, my dear sir, so the matter stands. You don't know Mr. Montague? I'm sorry for it. A remarkably handsome man, and quite the gentleman in every respect. Property, I am told, in India. House and everything belonging to him, beautiful. Costly furniture on the most elegant and lavish scale, and pictures which even in an anatomical point of view are perfection. In case you should ever think of doing anything with the company, I'll pass you, you may depend upon it. I can conscientiously report you a healthy subject. If I understand any man's constitution, it is yours, and this little indisposition has done him more good, ma'am," says the doctor, turning to the patient's wife, "than if he had swallowed the contents of half the nonsensical bottles in my surgery. For they are nonsense, to tell the honest truth. One half of them are nonsense, compared with such a constitution as his. Jobling is the most friendly creature I ever met with in my life," thinks the patient, "and upon my word and honour I'll consider of it." "Commission to you, doctor, on 4 new policies, and a loan this morning, eh?" said Crimple, looking, when they had finished lunch, over some papers brought in by the porter. "Well done." "Jobling, my dear friend," said Tigg, "long life to you." "No, no, nonsense. Upon my word I've no right to draw the commission," said the doctor. "I haven't really. It's picking your pocket. I don't recommend anybody here. I only say what I know. My patients ask me what I know, and I tell 'em what I know. Nothing else. Caution is my weak side. That's the truth, and always was from a boy. That is," said the doctor, filling his glass, "caution in behalf of other people. Whether I would repose confidence in this company myself, if I had not been paying money elsewhere for many years, that's quite another question." He tried to look as if there were no doubt about it, but feeling that he did it but indifferently, changed the theme and praised the wine. "Talking of wine," said the doctor, "reminds me of one of the finest glasses of light old port I ever drank in my life, and that was at a funeral. You have not seen anything of that party, Mr. Montague, have you?" handing him a card. "He is not buried, I hope," said Tigg, as he took it. "The honour of his company is not requested, if he is." "Ha, ha!" laughed the doctor. "No, not quite. He was honourably connected with that very occasion, though." "Oh?" said Tigg, smoothing his moustache as he cast his eyes upon the name. "I recollect. No, he has not been here." The words were on his lips when Bullamy entered and presented a card to the medical officer. "Talk of the what's his name," observed the doctor, rising. "And he's sure to appear, eh?" said Tigg. "Why, no, Mr. Montague, no," returned the doctor. "We will not say that in the present case, for this gentleman is very far from it." "So much the better," retorted Tigg. "So much the more adaptable to the Anglo Bengali. Bullamy, clear the table and take the things out by the other door. Mr. Crimple, business." "Shall I introduce him?" asked Jobling. "I shall be eternally delighted," answered Tigg, kissing his hand and smiling sweetly. The doctor disappeared into the outer office, and immediately returned with Jonas Chuzzlewit. "Mr. Montague," said Jobling, "allow me, my friend Mr. Chuzzlewit, my dear friend, our chairman. Now do you know," he added, checking himself with infinite policy, and looking round with a smile, "that's a very singular instance of the force of example. It really is a very remarkable instance of the force of example. I say our chairman. Why do I say our chairman? Because he is not my chairman, you know. I have no connection with the company, farther than giving them, for a certain fee and reward, my poor opinion as a medical man, precisely as I may give it any day to Jack Noakes or Tom Styles. Then why do I say our chairman? Simply because I hear the phrase constantly repeated about me. Such is the involuntary operation of the mental faculty in the imitative biped man. Mr. Crimple, I believe you never take snuff. Injudicious. You should." Pending these remarks on the part of the doctor, and the lengthened and sonorous pinch with which he followed them up, Jonas took a seat at the board, as ungainly a man as ever he has been within the reader's knowledge. It is too common with all of us, but it is especially in the nature of a mean mind, to be overawed by fine clothes and fine furniture. They had a very decided influence on Jonas. "Now you two gentlemen have business to discuss, I know," said the doctor, "and your time is precious, so is mine, for several lives are waiting for me in the next room, and I have a round of visits to make after I have taken 'em. Having had the happiness to introduce you to each other, I may go about my business. Good bye. But allow me, Mr. Montague, before I go, to say this of my friend who sits beside you. That gentleman has done more, sir," rapping his snuff box solemnly, "to reconcile me to human nature than any man alive or dead. Good bye." With these words Jobling bolted abruptly out of the room, and proceeded in his own official department to impress the lives in waiting with a sense of his keen conscientiousness in the discharge of his duty, and the great difficulty of getting into the Anglo Bengali, by feeling their pulses, looking at their tongues, listening at their ribs, poking them in the chest, and so forth, though, if he didn't well know beforehand that whatever kind of lives they were, the Anglo Bengali would accept them readily, he was far from being the Jobling that his friend considered him, and was not the original Jobling, but a spurious imitation. Mr. Crimple also departed on the business of the morning, and Jonas Chuzzlewit and Tigg were left alone. "I learn from our friend," said Tigg, drawing his chair towards Jonas with a winning ease of manner, "that you have been thinking—" "Oh, ecod, then he'd no right to say so," cried Jonas, interrupting. "I didn't tell him my thoughts. If he took it into his head that I was coming here for such or such a purpose, why, that's his lookout. I don't stand committed by that." Jonas said this offensively enough, for over and above the habitual distrust of his character, it was in his nature to seek to revenge himself on the fine clothes and the fine furniture, in exact proportion as he had been unable to withstand their influence. "If I come here to ask a question or two, and get a document or two to consider of, I don't bind myself to anything. Let's understand that, you know," said Jonas. "My dear fellow," cried Tigg, clapping him on the shoulder, "I applaud your frankness. If men like you and I speak openly at first, all possible misunderstanding is avoided. Why should I disguise what you know so well, but what the crowd never dream of? We companies are all birds of prey, mere birds of prey. The only question is, whether in serving our own turn we can serve yours too, whether in double lining our own nest we can put a single lining into yours. Oh, you're in our secret, you're behind the scenes. We'll make a merit of dealing plainly with you, when we know we can't help it." It was remarked, on the first introduction of Mr. Jonas into these pages, that there is a simplicity of cunning no less than a simplicity of innocence, and that in all matters involving a faith in knavery he was the most credulous of men. If Mr. Tigg had preferred any claim to high and honourable dealing, Jonas would have suspected him, though he had been a very model of probity. But when he gave utterance to Jonas's own thoughts of everything and everybody, Jonas began to feel that he was a pleasant fellow, and one to be talked to freely. He changed his position in the chair, not for a less awkward, but for a more boastful attitude, and smiling in his miserable conceit, rejoined, "You ain't a bad man of business, Mr. Montague. You know how to set about it, I will say." "Tut, tut," said Tigg, nodding confidentially and showing his white teeth. "We are not children, Mr. Chuzzlewit. We are grown men, I hope." Jonas assented, and said after a short silence, first spreading out his legs and sticking one arm akimbo to show how perfectly at home he was, "The truth is—" "Don't say the truth," interposed Tigg with another grin. "It's so like humbug." Greatly charmed by this, Jonas began again. "The long and the short of it is—" "Better," muttered Tigg, "much better. That I didn't consider myself very well used by one or two of the old companies in some negotiations I have had with them. Once had, I mean. They started objections they had no right to start, and put questions they had no right to put, and carried things much too high for my taste." As he made these observations he cast down his eyes and looked curiously at the carpet. Mr. Tigg looked curiously at him. He made so long a pause that Tigg came to the rescue and said, in his pleasantest manner, "Take a glass of wine." "No, no," returned Jonas, with a cunning shake of the head. "None of that, thank'ee. No wine over business. All very well for you, but it wouldn't do for me." "What an old hand you are, Mr. Chuzzlewit," said Tigg, leaning back in his chair and leering at him through his half-shut eyes. Jonas shook his head again, as much as to say, "You're right there," and then resumed jocosely, "Not such an old hand either, but that I've been and got married. That's rather green, you'll say. Perhaps it is, especially as she's young. But one never knows what may happen to these women, so I'm thinking of insuring her life. It is but fair, you know, that a man should secure some consolation in case of meeting with such a loss." "If anything can console him under such heartbreaking circumstances," murmured Tigg, with his eyes shut up as before. "Exactly," returned Jonas, "if anything can. Now, supposing I did it here, I should do it cheap, I know, and easy, without bothering her about it, which I'd much rather not do, for it's just in a woman's way to take it into her head, if you talk to her about such things, that she's going to die directly." "So it is," cried Tigg, kissing his hand in honour of the sex. "You're quite right. Sweet, silly, fluttering little simpletons." "Well," said Jonas, "on that account, you know, and because offence has been given me in other quarters, I wouldn't mind patronizing this company. But I want to know what sort of security there is for the company's going on. That's the—" "Not the truth," cried Tigg, holding up his jewelled hand. "Don't use that Sunday school expression, please." "The long and the short of it," said Jonas. "The long and the short of it is, what's the security?" "The paid up capital, my dear sir," said Tigg, referring to some papers on the table, "is at this present moment—" "Oh, I understand all about paid up capitals, you know," said Jonas. "You do?" cried Tigg, stopping short. "I should hope so." He turned the papers down again, and moving nearer to him, said in his ear, "I know you do. I know you do. Look at me." It was not much in Jonas's way to look straight at anybody, but thus requested he made shift to take a tolerable survey of the chairman's features. The chairman fell back a little to give him the better opportunity. "You know me?" he inquired, elevating his eyebrows. "You recollect you've seen me before?" "Why, I thought I remembered your face when I first came in," said Jonas, gazing at it. "But I couldn't call to mind where I had seen it." "No, I don't remember even now. Was it in the street?" "Was it in Pecksniff's parlour?" said Tigg. "In Pecksniff's parlour!" echoed Jonas, fetching a long breath. "You don't mean when—" "Yes," cried Tigg, "when there was a very charming and delightful little family party, at which yourself and your respected father assisted." "Well, never mind him," said Jonas. "He's dead, and there's no help for it." "Dead, is he?" cried Tigg. "Venerable old gentleman, is he dead? You're very like him." Jonas received this compliment with anything but a good grace, perhaps because of his own private sentiments in reference to the personal appearance of his deceased parent, perhaps because he was not best pleased to find that Montague and Tigg were one. That gentleman perceived it, and tapping him familiarly on the sleeve, beckoned him to the window. From this moment Mr. Montague's jocularity and flow of spirits were remarkable. "Do you find me at all changed since that time?" he asked. "Speak plainly." Jonas looked hard at his waistcoat and jewels, and said, "Rather, ecod." "Was I at all seedy in those days?" asked Montague. "Precious seedy," said Jonas. Mr. Montague pointed down into the street, where Bailey and the cab were in attendance. "Neat, perhaps dashing. Do you know whose it is?" "No." "Mine. Do you like this room?" "It must have cost a lot of money," said Jonas. "You're right. Mine too. Why don't you," he whispered this, and nudged him in the side with his elbow, "why don't you take premiums instead of paying 'em? That's what a man like you should do. Join us." Jonas stared at him in amazement. "Is that a crowded street?" asked Montague, calling his attention to the multitude without. "Very," said Jonas, only glancing at it, and immediately afterwards looking at him again. "There are printed calculations," said his companion, "which will tell you pretty nearly how many people will pass up and down that thoroughfare in the course of a day. I can tell you how many of 'em will come in here, merely because they find this office here, knowing no more about it than they do of the pyramids. Ha ha! Join us. You shall come in cheap." Jonas looked at him harder and harder. "I can tell you," said Tigg in his ear, "how many of 'em will buy annuities, effect insurances, bring us their money in 100 shapes and ways, force it upon us, trust us as if we were the mint, yet know no more about us than you do of that crossing sweeper at the corner. Not so much. Ha ha!" Jonas gradually broke into a smile. "Yah!" said Montague, giving him a pleasant thrust in the breast. "You're too deep for us, you dog, or I wouldn't have told you. Dine with me to-morrow in Pall Mall." "I will," said Jonas. "Done!" cried Montague. "Wait a bit. Take these papers with you and look 'em over. See," he said, snatching some printed forms from the table. "B is a little tradesman, clerk, parson, artist, author, any common thing you like." "Yes," said Jonas, looking greedily over his shoulder. "Well?" "B wants a loan, say 50 or 100 pound, perhaps more. No matter. B proposes self and 2 securities. B is accepted. 2 securities give a bond. B assures his own life for double the amount, and brings 2 friends' lives also, just to patronize the office. Ha ha ha! Is that a good notion?" "Ecod, that's a capital notion," cried Jonas. "But does he really do it?" "Do it?" repeated the chairman. "B's hard up, my good fellow, and will do anything, don't you see? It's my idea." "It does you honour. I'm blessed if it don't," said Jonas. "I think it does," replied the chairman, "and I'm proud to hear you say so. B pays the highest lawful interest—" "That an't much," interrupted Jonas. "Right, quite right," retorted Tigg. "And hard it is upon the part of the law that it should be so confoundedly down upon us unfortunate victims, when it takes such amazing good interest for itself from all its clients. But charity begins at home, and justice begins next door. Well, the law being hard upon us, we're not exactly soft upon B, for besides charging B the regular interest, we get B's premium and B's friends' premiums, and we charge B for the bond, and whether we accept him or not, we charge B for inquiries. We keep a man at £1 a week to make 'em. And we charge B a trifle for the secretary. And in short, my good fellow, we stick it into B up hill and down dale, and make a devilish comfortable little property out of him. Ha ha ha! I drive B, in point of fact," said Tigg, pointing to the cabriolet, "and a thoroughbred horse he is. Ha ha ha!" Jonas enjoyed this joke very much indeed. It was quite in his peculiar vein of humour. "Then," said Tigg Montague, "we grant annuities on the very lowest and most advantageous terms known in the money market. And the old ladies and gentlemen down in the country buy 'em. Ha ha ha! And we pay 'em too, perhaps. Ha ha ha!" "But there's responsibility in that," said Jonas, looking doubtful. "I take it all myself," said Tigg Montague. "Here I am responsible for everything. The only responsible person in the establishment. Ha ha ha! Then there are the life assurances without loans, the common policies, very profitable, very comfortable, money down, you know, repeated every year, capital fun." "But when they begin to fall in," observed Jonas, "it's all very well while the office is young, but when the policies begin to die, that's what I am thinking of." "At the first start, my dear fellow," said Montague, "to show you how correct your judgment is, we had a couple of unlucky deaths that brought us down to a grand piano." "Brought you down where?" cried Jonas. "I give you my sacred word of honour," said Tig Montague, "that I raised money on every other individual piece of property, and was left alone in the world with a grand piano. And it was an upright grand too, so that I couldn't even sit upon it. But, my dear fellow, we got over it. We granted a great many new policies that week, liberal allowance to solicitors, by the by, and got over it in no time. Whenever they should chance to fall in heavily, as you very justly observe they may, one of these days, then—" He finished the sentence in so low a whisper that only one disconnected word was audible, and that imperfectly, but it sounded like "bolt." "Why, you're as bold as brass," said Jonas, in the utmost admiration. "A man can well afford to be as bold as brass, my good fellow, when he gets gold in exchange," cried the chairman, with a laugh that shook him from head to foot. "You'll dine with me to morrow?" "At what time?" asked Jonas. "7. Here's my card. Take the documents. I see you'll join us." "I don't know about that," said Jonas. "There's a good deal to be looked into first." "You shall look," said Montague, slapping him on the back, "into anything and everything you please. But you'll join us, I am convinced. You were made for it. Bullamy?" Obedient to the summons and the little bell, the waistcoat appeared. Being charged to show Jonas out, it went before, and the voice within it cried as usual, "By your leave there, by your leave. Gentlemen from the board room, by your leave." Mr. Montague, being left alone, pondered for some moments, and then said, raising his voice, "Is Nadgett in the office there?" "Here he is, sir," and he promptly entered, shutting the board room door after him, as carefully as if he were about to plot a murder. He was the man at £1 a week who made the inquiries. It was no virtue or merit in Nadgett that he transacted all his Anglo-Bengali business secretly and in the closest confidence. For he was born to be a secret. He was a short, dried up, withered old man, who seemed to have secreted his very blood, for nobody would have given him credit for the possession of 6 ounces of it in his whole body. How he lived was a secret. Where he lived was a secret. And even what he was a secret. In his musty old pocket book he carried contradictory cards, in some of which he called himself a coal merchant, in others a wine merchant, in others a commission agent, in others a collector, in others an accountant. As if he really didn't know the secret himself. He was always keeping appointments in the city, and the other man never seemed to come. He would sit on 'Change for hours, looking at everybody who walked in and out, and would do the like at Garraway's, and in other business coffee rooms, in some of which he would be occasionally seen drying a very damp pocket handkerchief before the fire, and still looking over his shoulder for the man who never appeared. He was mildewed, threadbare, shabby, always had flew upon his legs and back, and kept his linen so secretly, buttoning up and wrapping over, that he might have had none. Perhaps he hadn't. He carried one stained beaver glove, which he dangled before him by the forefinger as he walked or sat, but even its fellow was a secret. Some people said he had been a bankrupt, others that he had gone an infant into an ancient chancery suit which was still depending, but it was all a secret. He carried bits of sealing wax and a hieroglyphical old copper seal in his pocket, and often secretly indited letters in corner boxes of the trysting places before mentioned, but they never appeared to go to anybody, for he would put them into a secret place in his coat and deliver them to himself weeks afterwards, very much to his own surprise, quite yellow. He was that sort of man that if he had died worth 1,000,000 of money, or had died worth 2d halfpenny, everybody would have been perfectly satisfied, and would have said it was just as they expected. And yet he belonged to a class, a race peculiar to the city, who are secrets as profound to one another as they are to the rest of mankind. "Mr. Nadgett," said Montague, copying Jonas Chuzzlewit's address upon a piece of paper from the card which was still lying on the table, "any information about this name I shall be glad to have myself. Don't you mind what it is. Any you can scrape together bring me. Bring it to me, Mr. Nadgett." Nadgett put on his spectacles and read the name attentively, then looked at the chairman over his glasses and bowed, then took them off and put them in their case, and then put the case in his pocket. When he had done so, he looked without his spectacles at the paper as it lay before him, and at the same time produced his pocket-book from somewhere about the middle of his spine. Large as it was very full of documents, but he found a place for this one, and having clasped it carefully, passed it by a kind of solemn legerdemain into the same region as before. He withdrew with another bow and without a word, opening the door no wider than was sufficient for his passage out, and shutting it as carefully as before. The chairman of the board employed the rest of the morning in affixing his sign manual of gracious acceptance to various new proposals of annuity purchase and assurance. The company was looking up, for they flowed in gaily. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 28. Mr. Montague at home and Mr. Jonas Chuzzlewit at home. There were many powerful reasons for Jonas Chuzzlewit being strongly prepossessed in favor of the scheme which its great originator had so boldly laid open to him. But three among them stood prominently forward. Firstly, there was money to be made by it. Secondly, the money had the peculiar charm of being sagaciously obtained at other people's cost. Thirdly, it involved much outward show of homage and distinction, a board being an awful institution in its own sphere, and a director a mighty man. To make a swinging profit, have a lot of chaps to order about, and get into regular good society by one and the same means, and them so easy to one's hand, ain't such a bad lookout, thought Jonas. The latter considerations were only second to his avarice, for conscious that there was nothing in his person, conduct, character, or accomplishments to command respect, he was greedy of power, and was in his heart as much a tyrant as any laurelled conqueror on record. But he determined to proceed with cunning and caution, and to be very keen on his observation of the gentility of Mr. Montague's private establishment. For it no more occurred to this shallow knave that Montague wanted him to be so, or he wouldn't have invited him while his decision was yet in abeyance, than the possibility of that genius being able to overreach him in any way, pierced through his self-deceit by the inlet of a needle's point. He had said in the outset that Jonas was too sharp for him, and Jonas, who would have been sharp enough to believe him in nothing else, though he had solemnly sworn it, believed him in that instantly. It was with a faltering hand, and yet with an imbecile attempt at a swagger, that he knocked at his new friend's door in Pall Mall when the appointed hour arrived. Mr. Bailey quickly answered to the summons. He was not proud, and was kindly disposed to take notice of Jonas, but Jonas had forgotten him. "Mr. Montague at home?" "I should hope he was at home, and waiting dinner too," said Bailey, with the ease of an old acquaintance. "Will you take your hat up along with you, or leave it here?" Mr. Jonas preferred leaving it there. "The hold name, I suppose," said Bailey with a grin. Mr. Jonas stared at him in mute indignation. "What? Don't you remember Hold Mother Todgers's?" said Mr. Bailey, with his favourite action of the knees and boots. "Don't you remember my taking your name up to the young ladies when you came a-courting there? A reg'lar scaly old shop, warn't it? Times is changed, ain't they? I say, how you've growed." Without pausing for any acknowledgment of this compliment, he ushered the visitor upstairs, and having announced him, retired with a private wink. The lower story of the house was occupied by a wealthy tradesman, But Mr. Montague had all the upper portion, and splendid lodging it was. The room in which he received Jonas was a spacious and elegant apartment, furnished with extreme magnificence, decorated with pictures, copies from the antique in alabaster and marble, china vases, lofty mirrors, crimson hangings of the richest silk, gilded carvings, luxurious couches, glistening cabinets inlaid with precious woods, costly toys of every sort in negligent abundance. The only guests besides Jonas were the doctor, the resident director, and two other gentlemen whom Montague presented in due form. "My dear friend, I am delighted to see you. Jobling, you know, I believe." "I think so," said the doctor pleasantly, as he stepped out of the circle to shake hands. "I trust I have the honour. I hope so. My dear sir, I see you well. Quite well. That's well." "Mr. Wolf," said Montague, as soon as the doctor would allow him to introduce the two others. "Mr. Chuzzlewit. Mr. Pip, Mr. Chuzzlewit." Both gentlemen were exceedingly happy to have the honour of making Mr. Chuzzlewit's acquaintance. The doctor drew Jonas a little apart, and whispered behind his hand, "Men of the world, my dear sir, men of the world. Mr. Wolf, literary character. You needn't mention it. Remarkably clever weekly paper. Oh, remarkably clever. Mr. Pip, theatrical man. Capital man to know. Oh, capital man." "Well," said Wolf, folding his arms and resuming a conversation which the arrival of Jonas had interrupted, "and what did Lord Nobley say to that?" "Why," returned Pip with an oath, "he didn't know what to say. Same, sir, if he wasn't as mute as a poker. But you know what a good fellow Nobley is." "The best fellow in the world," cried Wolf. "It was only last week that Nobley said to me, 'By Gad, Wolf, I've got a living to bestow, and if you had but been brought up at the university, strike me blind if I wouldn't have made a parson of you.'" "Just like him," said Pip with another oath. "And he'd have done it." "Not a doubt of it," said Wolf. "But you were going to tell us—" "Oh, yes," cried Pip, "to be sure, so I was. At first he was dumb, sewn up dead, sir. But after a minute he said to the Duke, 'Here's Pip. Ask Pip. Pip's our mutual friend. Ask Pip. He knows.' 'Damme,' said the Duke, 'I appeal to Pip then. Come, Pip, bandy or not bandy? Speak out.' 'Bandy, your Grace, by the Lord Harry,' said I. 'Ha, ha!' laughed the Duke. 'To be sure she is. Bravo, Pip. Well said, Pip. I wish I may die if you're not a trump, Pip. Pop me down among your fashionable visitors whenever I'm in town, Pip.' And so I do, to this day." The conclusion of this story gave immense satisfaction, which was in no degree lessened by the announcement of dinner. Jonas repaired to the dining room along with his distinguished host, and took his seat at the board between that individual and his friend the doctor. The rest fell into their places like men who were well accustomed to the house, and dinner was done full justice to by all parties. It was as good a one as money or credit, no matter which, could produce. The dishes, wines, and fruits were of the choicest kind. Everything was elegantly served. The plate was gorgeous. Mr. Jonas was in the midst of a calculation of the value of this item alone when his host disturbed him. "A glass of wine?" "Oh," said Jonas, who had had several glasses already. "As much of that as you like. It's too good to refuse." "Well said, Mr. Chuzzlewit," cried Wolf. "Tom Gag, upon my soul," said Pip. "Positively, you know, that's— Ha, ha, ha!" observed the doctor, laying down his knife and fork for one instant, and then going to work again pell-mell. "That's epigrammatic, quite." "You're tolerably comfortable, I hope," said Tigg, apart to Jonas. "Oh, you needn't trouble your head about me," he replied. "Famous." "I thought it best not to have a party," said Tigg. "You feel that?" "Why, what do you call this?" retorted Jonas. "You don't mean to say you do this every day, do you?" "My dear fellow," said Montague, shrugging his shoulders, "every day of my life when I dine at home. This is my common style. It was of no use having anything uncommon for you. You'd have seen through it." "You'll have a party?" said Crimple. "No, I won't," I said. "He shall take us in the rough." "And pretty smooth too, ecod," said Jonas, glancing round the table. "This don't cost a trifle." "Why, to be candid with you, it does not," returned the other. "But I like this sort of thing. It's the way I spend my money." Jonas thrust his tongue into his cheek and said, "Was it?" "When you join us you won't get rid of your share of the profits in the same way?" said Tigg. "Quite different," retorted Jonas. "Well, and you're right," said Tigg with friendly candor. "You needn't. It's not necessary. One of a company must do it to hold the connection together. But as I take a pleasure in it, that's my department. You don't mind dining expensively at another man's expense, I hope?" "Not a bit," said Jonas. "Then I hope you'll often dine with me." "Ah," said Jonas, "I don't mind. On the contrary." "And I'll never attempt to talk business to you over wine, I take my oath," said Tigg. "Oh, deep, deep, deep of you this morning. I must tell 'em that. They're the very men to enjoy it. Pip, my good fellow, I've a splendid little trait to tell you of my friend Chuzzlewit, who is the deepest dog I know. I give you my sacred word of honor, he is the deepest dog I know, Pip." Pip swore a frightful oath that he was sure of it already, and the anecdote being told was received with loud applause as an incontestable proof of Mr. Jonas's greatness. Pip, in a natural spirit of emulation, then related some instances of his own depth, and Wolf, not to be left behindhand, recited the leading points of one or two vastly humorous articles he was then preparing. These lucubrations, being of what he called a warm complexion, were highly approved, and all the company agreed that they were full of point. "Men of the world, my dear sir," Jobling whispered to Jonas. "Thorough men of the world. To a professional person like myself it's quite refreshing to come into this kind of society. It's not only agreeable, and nothing can be more agreeable, but it's philosophically improving. It's character, my dear sir, character. It is so pleasant to find real merit appreciated, whatever its particular walk in life may be, that the general harmony of the company was doubtless much promoted by their knowing that the two men of the world were held in great esteem by the upper classes of society, and by the gallant defenders of their country in the army and navy, but particularly the former. The least of their stories had a colonel in it. Lords were as plentiful as oaths, and even the blood royal ran in the muddy channel of their personal recollections. "Mr. Chuzzlewit didn't know him, I'm afraid," said Wolf, in reference to a certain personage of illustrious descent who had previously figured in a reminiscence. "No," said Tigg, "but we must bring him into contact with this sort of fellows." "He was very fond of literature," observed Wolf. "Was he?" said Tigg. "Oh, yes, he took my paper regularly for many years. Do you know, he said some good things now and then. He asked a certain viscount, who's a friend of mine, Pip knows him, 'What's the editor's name? What's the editor's name?' 'Wolf.' 'Wolf, eh? Sharp biter, Wolf. We must keep the wolf from the door, as the proverb says.' It was very well, and being complimentary, I printed it." "But the viscount's the boy," cried Pip, who invented a new oath for the introduction of everything he said. "The viscount's the boy. He came into our place one night to take her home, rather slewed, but not much, and said, 'Where's Pip? I want to see Pip. Produce Pip.' 'What's the row, my lord?' 'Shakespeare's an infernal humbug, Pip.' 'What's the good of Shakespeare, Pip? I never read him.' 'What the devil is it all about, Pip? There's a lot of feet in Shakespeare's verse, but there ain't any legs worth mentioning in Shakespeare's plays, are there, Pip? Juliet, Desdemona, Lady Macbeth, and all the rest of 'em, whatever their names are, might as well have no legs at all, for anything the audience know about it, Pip. Why, in that respect they're all Miss Biffins to the audience, Pip. I'll tell you what it is. What the people call dramatic poetry is a collection of sermons. Do I go to the theatre to be lectured? No, Pip. If I wanted that, I'd go to church. What's the legitimate object of the drama, Pip? Human nature. What are legs? Human nature. Then let us have plenty of leg pieces, Pip, and I'll stand by you, my buck." And I am proud to say, added Pip, that he did stand by me handsomely. The conversation now becoming general, Mr. Jonas's opinion was requested on this subject, and as it was in full accordance with the sentiments of Mr. Pip, that gentleman was extremely gratified. Indeed, both himself and Wolf had so much in common with Jonas that they became very amicable, and between their increasing friendship and the fumes of wine, Jonas grew talkative. It does not follow in the case of such a person that the more talkative he becomes the more agreeable he is. On the contrary, his merits showed a most advantage, perhaps, in silence. Having no means, as he thought, of putting himself on an equality with the rest, but by the assertion of that depth and sharpness on which he had been complimented, Jonas exhibited that faculty to the utmost, and was so deep and sharp that he lost himself in his own profundity, and cut his fingers with his own edge-tools. It was especially in his way and character to exhibit his quality at his entertainer's expense, and while he drank of his sparkling wines and partook of his monstrous profusion, to ridicule the extravagance which had set such costly fare before him. Even at such a wanton board, and in such more than doubtful company, this might have proved a disagreeable experiment, but that Tigg and Crimple, studying to understand their man thoroughly, gave him what license he chose, knowing that the more he took the better for their purpose. And thus, while the blundering cheat, gull that he was for all his cunning, thought himself rolled up hedgehog fashion with his sharpest points towards them, he was in fact betraying all his vulnerable parts to their unwinking watchfulness. Whether the two gentlemen who contributed so much to the doctor's philosophical knowledge (by the way, the doctor slipped off quietly after swallowing his usual amount of wine) had had their cue distinctly from the host, or took it from what they saw and heard, they acted their parts very well. They solicited the honour of Jonas's better acquaintance, trusted that they would have the pleasure of introducing him into that elevated society in which he was so well qualified to shine, and informed him in the most friendly manner that the advantages of their respective establishments were entirely at his control. In a word, they said, "Be one of us," and Jonas said he was infinitely obliged to them, and he would be, adding within himself that so long as they stood treat there was nothing he would like better. After coffee, which was served in the drawing-room, there was a short interval, mainly sustained by Pip and Wolf, of conversation, rather highly spiced and strongly seasoned. When it flagged, Jonas took it up and showed considerable humour in appraising the furniture, inquiring whether such an article was paid for, what it had originally cost, and the like. In all of this he was, as he considered, desperately hard on Montague, and very demonstrative of his own brilliant parts. Some champagne punch gave a new though temporary fillip to the entertainments of the evening, for after leading to some noisy proceedings which were not intelligible, it ended in the unsteady departure of the two gentlemen of the world, and the slumber of Mr. Jonas upon one of the sofas. As he could not be made to understand where he was, Mr. Bailey received orders to call a hackney coach and take him home, which that young gentleman roused himself from an uneasy sleep in the hall to do, it being now almost 3 o'clock in the morning. "Is he hooked, do you think?" whispered Crimple, as himself and partner stood in a distant part of the room, observing him as he lay. "Aye," said Tigg in the same tone. "With a strong iron, perhaps. Has Nadgett been here to-night?" "Yes, I went out to him. Hearing you had company, he went away." "Why did he do that?" "He said he would come back early in the morning, before you were out of bed." "Tell them to be sure and send him up to my bedside. Hush, here's the boy. Now, Mr. Bailey, take this gentleman home and see him safely in. Hello there! Why, Chuzzlewit, halloa!" They got him upright with some difficulty, and assisted him downstairs, where they put his hat upon his head, and tumbled him into the coach. Mr. Bailey, having shut him in, mounted the box beside the coachman, and smoked his cigar with an air of particular satisfaction, the undertaking in which he was engaged having a free and sporting character about it, which was quite congenial to his taste. Arriving in due time at the house in the city, Mr. Bailey jumped down, and expressed the lively nature of his feelings in a knock the like of which had probably not been heard in that quarter since the great fire of London. Going out into the road to observe the effect of this feat, he saw that a dim light, previously visible at an upper window, had been already removed and was travelling downstairs. To obtain a foreknowledge of the bearer of this taper, Mr. Bailey skipped back to the door again and put his eye to the keyhole. It was the Merry One herself, but sadly, strangely altered. So careworn and dejected, so faltering and full of fear, so fallen, humbled, broken, that to have seen her quiet in her coffin would have been a less surprise. She set the light upon a bracket in the hall, and laid her hand upon her heart, upon her eyes, upon her burning head. Then she came on towards the door with such a wild and hurried step that Mr. Bailey lost his self-possession, and still had his eye where the keyhole had been when she opened it. "Aha!" said Mr. Bailey with an effort. "There you are you? What's the matter? Ain't you well, though?" In the midst of her astonishment as she recognized him in his altered dress, so much of her old smile came back to her face that Bailey was glad. But next moment he was sorry again, for he saw tears standing in her poor dim eyes. "Don't be frightened," said Bailey. "There ain't nothing the matter. I brought home Mr. Chuzzlewit. He ain't ill. He's only a little swipey, you know." Mr. Bailey reeled in his boots to express intoxication. "Have you come from Mrs. Todgers's?" asked Mary, trembling. "Todgers's? Bless you, no!" cried Mr. Bailey. "I haven't got nothin' to do with Todgers's. I cut that connection long ago. He's been a dining with my governor at the West End. Didn't you know he was a coming to see us?" "No," she said faintly. "Oh, yes, we're heavy swells, too, and so I tell you. Don't you come out a catching cold in your head. I'll wake him." Mr. Bailey, expressing in his demeanor a perfect confidence that he could carry him in with ease if necessary, opened the coach door, let down the steps, and giving Jonas a shake, cried, "We've got home, my flower. Tumble up, then." He was so far recovered as to be able to respond to this appeal, and to come stumbling out of the coach in a heap, to the great hazard of Mr. Bailey's person. When he got upon the pavement, Mr. Bailey first butted at him in front, and then dexterously propped him up behind, and having steadied him by these means, he assisted him into the house. "You go up first with the light," said Bailey to Mrs. Jonas, "and we'll foller. Don't tremble so. He won't hurt you. When I've had a drop too much, I'm full of good natur myself." She went on before, and her husband and Bailey, by dint of tumbling over each other and knocking themselves about, got at last into the sitting room above stairs, where Jonas staggered into a seat. "There," said Mr. Bailey, "he's all right now. You ain't got nothing to cry for, bless you. He's righter than a trivet." The ill-favored brute, with dress awry and sodden face and rumpled hair, sat blinking and drooping and rolling his idiotic eyes about, until, becoming conscious by degrees, he recognized his wife and shook his fist at her. "Ah!" cried Mr. Bailey, squaring his arms with a sudden emotion. "What, you're wicious, are you? Would you, though? You'd better not." "Pray go away," said Mary. "Bailey, my good boy, go home. Jonas," she said timidly, laying her hand upon his shoulder and bending her head down over him. "Jonas." "Look at her!" cried Jonas, pushing her off with his extended arm. "Look here! Look at her! Here's a bargain for a man." "Dear Jonas." "Dear devil!" he replied with a fierce gesture. "You're a pretty clog to be tied to a man for life, you mewling, white-faced cat. Get out of my sight." "I know you don't mean it, Jonas. You wouldn't say it if you were sober." With affected gaiety she gave Bailey a piece of money, and again implored him to be gone. Her entreaty was so earnest that the boy had not the heart to stay there. But he stopped at the bottom of the stairs and listened. "I wouldn't say it if I was sober," retorted Jonas. "You know better. Have I never said it when I was sober?" "Often indeed," she answered through her tears. "Harkye," cried Jonas, stamping his foot upon the ground. "You made me bear your pretty humours once, and ecod I'll make you bear mine now. I always promised myself I would. I married you that I might. I'll know who's master and who's slave." "Heaven knows I am obedient," said the sobbing girl, "much more so than I ever thought to be." Jonas laughed in his drunken exultation. "What? You're finding it out, are you? Patience, and you will in time. Griffins have claws, my girl. There's not a pretty slight you ever put upon me, nor a pretty trick you ever played me, nor a pretty insolence you ever showed me, that I won't pay back 100-fold. What else did I marry you for? You, too," he said, with coarse contempt. It might have softened him, indeed it might, to hear her turn a little fragment of a song he used to say he liked, trying with a heart so full to win him back. "Oho," he said, "you're deaf, are you? You don't hear me, eh? So much the better for you. I hate you. I hate myself for having been fool enough to strap a pack upon my back for the pleasure of treading on it whenever I choose. Why, things have opened to me now, so that I might marry almost where I liked. But I wouldn't. I'd keep single. I ought to be single, among the friends I know. Instead of that, here I am, tied like a log to you. Pah! Why do you show your pale face when I come home? Am I never to forget you?" "How late it is!" she said cheerfully, opening the shutter after an interval of silence. "Broad day, Jonas." "Broad day or black night, what do I care?" was the kind rejoinder. "The night passed quickly, too. I don't mind sitting up at all." "Sit up for me again, if you dare," growled Jonas. "I was reading," she proceeded, "all night long. I began when you went out, and read till you came home again. The strangest story, Jonas, and true, the book says. I'll tell it you to-morrow." "True, was it?" said Jonas doggedly. "So the book says." "Was there anything in it about a man's being determined to conquer his wife, break her spirit, bend her temper, crush all her humors like so many nutshells? Kill her, for aught I know?" said Jonas. "No, not a word," she answered quickly. "Oh," he returned, "that'll be a true story, though, before long, for all the book says nothing about it. It's a lying book, I see, a fit book for a lying reader. But you're deaf. I forgot that." There was another interval of silence, and the boy was stealing away when he heard her footstep on the floor and stopped. She went up to him, as it seemed, and spoke lovingly, saying that she would defer to him in everything, and would consult his wishes and obey them, and they might be very happy if he would be gentle with her. He answered with an imprecation and "Not with a blow?" "Yes. Stern truth against the base-souled villain. With a blow. No angry cries, no loud reproaches. Even her weeping and her sobs were stifled by her clinging round him. She only said, repeating in an agony of heart, 'How could he? Could he? Could he?' and lost utterance in tears. O woman, God beloved in old Jerusalem, the best among us need deal lightly with thy faults, if only for the punishment thy nature will endure in bearing heavy evidence against us on the day of judgment." End of chapter 28.